Chapter 56, Wednesday, May 6, 1778. Each regiment held its own service of Thanksgiving after breakfast the next day. Most officers and their ladies had attended with the New Jersey troops. Whilst they were worshiping, their servants, including Isabel and me, finished the preparations on the pavilion set up along the grand parade and unloaded the tables, chairs, benches, and crates that held dishes, glasses, food, and wine. The officers and ladies arrived just after we set the benches to the best location for watching the grand review of the troops. They took their places, with General and Lady Washington in the center. His Excellency was one of the tallest men I'd ever seen, with a calm face not much marred by the smallpox scars on his nose. Lady Washington was so tiny, the top of her head didn't even reach his shoulder. They sat close to each other, and sometimes he gazed at her with tenderness, and she at him in the same manner. "Here they come!" shouted a voice. All eyes looked to the top of the ridge. At the far end of the grand parade, a mattress touched a flame to the fire hole of a 9-pound cannon. It roared. All of those seated rose to their feet, clapping and calling. Billy Lee, General Washington's manservant, motioned for us serving folk to move away a bit. I knew the names of only a few of the slaves. Malvina, Lord Stirling's cook, with her bright yellow turban. Shrewsbury, John Lawrence's valet, who had been back and forth to York all winter, and Hannah, Isaac, and Jenny, owned by the Washingtons. We nodded politely to one another and turned our attention to the army. 11,000 soldiers in 5 columns marched down the slope and then onto the grand parade for the review as the fifes and drums played. A distant voice shouted a command, and the men shifted from a column formation to a line. Another shout, and they wheeled in their platoons until they had enough to form 2 long lines of more than 5,000 soldiers each. They halted. The Continental Army, that had starved and froze and survived the winter, stood perfectly still, shoulder to shoulder, in a field of honor in front of their commanding officer. A few companies had been outfitted with buff and blue uniform coats. Most fellows were in rifle dress, long hunting shirts worn over breeches that buckled at the knee, stockings under boots or shoes. They all wore hats, folded up in 3 places, and every man and every boy was whisker-free, with hair pulled back in a queue. Nearly everyone wore a new or well-repaired cartridge box hung from a leather strap, and they carried muskets that had been freshly oiled. All of the muskets had bayonets secured in place under the muzzles. I thought to myself, "Huzzah, General Greene! Well done, good sir!" For he had indeed pulled the matter of supplying the army out of the fires of disaster. Someone shouted a command at the far end of the field. The entire line of 13 cannons fired at once. All of the ladies and most of the serving folk covered their ears at the sound, but before there was even a moment for them to shriek or laugh, a running fire of shots started. This was the feu de joie I'd heard mentioned while serving, French words that seemed to mean, "Make a loud ruckus in a coordinated and impressive manner." The first man standing closest to the cannons lifted his musket and shot, and half a heartbeat after him, the fellow to his left shot, and then the next and the next, one by one, 5,000 fellows lifting their muskets and firing and reloading all the way to the last man in the front of the line. After he shot, the fellow behind him fired, and one by one, in perfect order, the 5,000 soldiers in the back executed their task, musket to shoulder, barrel raised, trigger pulled, and the shots roared along the rear line, left to right. When the last gun was fired, the soldiers shouted in one voice, "Huzzah! Long live the King of France!" The cannons fired another 13-gun salute. The army responded with a second round of running fire, right to left along the first line, left to right along the second. When the last gun was fired, the soldiers again shouted in one voice, "Long live the friendly European powers!" And to my astonishment, the 13 cannons roared a third time, and a third wave of running fire unfolded with proud precision. The field was clouded in thick smoke. None of the guns had been loaded with a musket ball or grape shot, but every man had used his full complement of gunpowder. As each man shot his third time, he did not reload his weapon, but stood at parade rest. As the last gun fired, there came the loudest shout of all, "Huzzah for the American States!" We all clapped until our hands were sore. The rest of the serving folk walked to the pavilion, but Isabel and I lingered. The soldiers stayed on the field long after they were excused from duty, laughing from the delight of a perfectly performed ceremony. Sergeants passed among them, sharing in extra rum rations that had been ordered. I rose up on my toes and shaded my eyes to better see the fellows. Isabel tugged on my sleeve. "Are you looking for your friends?" "They've probably already gone back to the hut." "You really liked being a soldier, didn't you?" "I'm still a soldier," I said. "I enlisted until the end of the war." "But they don't want you." "You're wrong." I pointed to the officers and the congressmen making their way to the pavilion for the feast. "Those are the folks who don't want me." "What about those fellows?" A ruckus group of lads loped about the smoke, shouting, "Huzzah! Huzzah!" at the top of their lungs. The three fellows in the front, Ebenezer, Benny, and Faulkner, caught sight of us first and stopped in their tracks 10 paces away from Isabel and me. Greenlaw stepped forward and yelled, "4th New Hampshire, Russell's Special Detachment, men of Luke Greenlaw, stand in line." The company of 11 fellows formed 2 lines with 5 standing in the front and 6 in the back. Several of the faces were new recruits I'd never met. "Formation!" shouted Greenlaw. "One missing soldier!" "Sir!" shouted the company. The 2 fellows on the right-hand side of the front line, Ebenezer and one of the new lads, stepped sideways, leaving a gap in the line big enough for another fellow. "Sir!" they screamed again. Greenlaw spun on his heel so that he faced us. He touched the brim of his hat. "This company will always hold a space for you, Private Smith." I bowed. "Wheel right!" Greenlaw shouted. The company turned to the right and marched off, keeping open the place that was mine. For once, I did not mind pouring wine, carrying plates of half-eaten food, standing by while the gentry ate and laughed and made merry. It did not bother me to see Isabel ferrying dishes and strawberries and cream cakes from the wagon of the pavilion, not even when she wiped the sweat off her brow with her apron. Our army was ready to go to war. When the Continental Army marched out of Valley Forge, we would be hidden in the middle of it. Chapter 57, Thursday, May 7th to Wednesday, May 13th, 1778. We lost our favorite ally at Moore Hall the next day. Mrs. Cook had received news that the wife of one of her grandsons was carrying a babe and was not having an easy time of it. General Greene arranged for a pass for the old lady so that she could travel into Philadelphia to help. Her son in the 5th Pennsylvania had hired a farmer to transport his mother and his parrot into the city. Isabel and I watched as William Cook helped his mother into the wagon and secured the birdcage at her feet. "I hope she feels better soon," Isabel said. "Soon as she's holding the little one, she'll feel fine," Mrs. Cook said. "She's a strong one. Isn't that right, William?" "Yes, Mother. Lucille is a sturdy lass," her son said as he threw the cloth over her cage of King George. "Mayhaps she'll name that babe after you if it's a girl. What the world needs is to set its rights is another Matilda Cook." "I should say not," scolded Mrs. Cook. Isabel handed up the old woman's shawl. "What should they call her, ma'am?" "They all called her Mattie." She wrapped the shawl around her shoulders. "Matilda sounds like an old hen. Mattie's the name of some gumption. I'll make sure Lucille agrees." She grabbed the wagon seat as the farmer climbed up next to her and picked up the reins. "Farewell. Good luck." Cooking was not a natural occupation for Isabel. Her pudding hardened into stone. Her stews tasted of the river. She served vegetables raw or charcoaled and did not pick out a slug from the salad greens, which caused Mrs. Greene to scream when she found it wiggling on her fork. Mr. Bellingham came to the kitchen to shout after that, and General Greene wrote letters inquiring about a replacement cook. I knew even less about cooking than Isabel and could not help her, but I did not much fret. She only had to tolerate this life for a few more weeks. General Washington had held a council of war and determined to stay in camp a while longer, possibly until the middle of June, before striking at the British. That gave us all the time we needed to prepare. I helped Isabel weed the garden so that I could explain my plan and tell her about the impression of the key that I had made in the wax. "I need some sort of substance that will fill the form and harden," I said. I think we can make a mold into a box of hard-pressed sand, but I need something that will take the exact shape of the key and press into the mold. I thought of manure. She carefully plucked the weeds from the base of the pea plants. What do the men who make things like bells use? I have no idea. I've never seen it done, just heard the blacksmith talking about it in Morristown. So how do you know it's going to work? I don't. She threw the weeds into the pile at the end of the row. Do you remember that misbegotten custard I made? The one you said had no eggs? Hard enough to drive nails, you said. I wager that would pour and harden good. But what are you going to fashion the key from? For that, I need to steal a musket ball. Aren't you in luck? She grinned. There are plenty of soldiers hereabouts. It took a few more days, but eventually we assembled everything we needed. A pail with wet sand that Isabel had pounded tight, 2 musket balls removed from a pouch in General Green's bedchamber, a ladle that would not be missed, and a fire in the kitchen hearth that blazed much higher than it needed to be. We waited an hour past the time the last of the upstairs folks had gone to sleep. Then Isabel wrapped my hands in thick cloth so I would not be burned. I set the musket balls in the cup of the ladle and hung it from the chain over the hottest part of the fire. We sat silent while the lead softened, then turned runny. Ready? Isabel asked. I nodded. She moved the sand pail next to the fire. Her pudding dough key had turned out as fine as we could hope and was planted firmly in the sand. She now lifted the key out. I took the ladle off the chain and, holding my breath, tried to pour a steady stream into the rough mold. It splattered some, but it quickly filled the key shape. Isabel poured more sand on top to cover the mold and then carefully set upon that a brick. How long until it's hard enough? She asked. We may have weeks, maybe a month before the army leaves. It'll be ready by then. I sat back on my heels and let out my breath. Can you feel it, country? We're almost gone. Chapter 58, Thursday, May 14th to Sunday, May 17th, 1778. 2 days after we poured the key, a group of Oneida warriors arrived at camp, there at the request of General Washington. They brought with them bushels of corn, for they had heard how hungry our soldiers were. An Oneida woman came too, name of Polly Cooper, to show how to make good soup from the corn in the manner of her people. His Excellency and General Knox were grateful for the corn, but they were most excited by the weapons. The warriors had brought their bows and arrows in addition to their muskets. In the time it took to load and shoot a musket once, a warrior could shoot 4 arrows or more. When I heard this discussed in the dining room, I thought to myself that it would be smarter to teach the entire army in the ways of bows and arrows. General Greene left for the Fishkill fort the same day. Bellingham had tried his best to convince the general he should accompany him, but he was foiled, to my relief. If he'd gone, he would have taken me and left Isabel behind to serve the ladies. Any separation now would be disastrous. In her husband's absence, Mrs. Greene arranged for a supper to keep her amused. Lady Washington loaned her Hannah, His Excellency's cook, for the occasion, which freed Isabel to put on her good blue short gown and clean skirt and serve the table with me. All of the windows in the dining room were open, as the May evening air was warm. Instead of smelling sour soldiers and wood smoke, the room was filled with odors of roasted beef, pickled beets, baked onions, and rosewater worn by Mrs. Greene, and the freshly powdered wigs of the gentlemen. Mrs. Greene had requested extra candles to light the table and fresh flowers in a bowl at the center of it. Despite the setting, Bellingham's mood was foul. Whilst the others laughed and conversated, he mostly drank wine and scowled. His nature was keenly sensitive to slights, and he took being left behind by General Greene as a bad omen. I avoided his gaze. We served the meal, which was much grander than anything ever prepared by Mrs. Cook. The ladies tried to steer the talk away from the war, but the gentlemen, most of them wearing officers' uniforms, always brought it back. New recruits were pouring into camp and needed time to learn the fighting drills of Baron von Steuben, which provoked a series of funny stories about the Baron's teaching techniques. A young fellow who was an aide to General Washington waved Isabel to the table to serve him more biscuits. He took 2 from the plate she held. "Did your girl bake these?" he asked Bellingham. "I should say not," answered Bellingham. "Isabel can't cook to save her life." Mrs. Green rapped the back of Bellingham's hand with her unfolded fan. "Do not disparage the talents of young Isabel. Her understanding of her needle is far superior to any I've met." Isabel backed up, set the platter of biscuits on the sideboard, and stood with her hands folded in front of her, her face empty. "Knowing how much you appreciate her skill," said Bellingham, "makes it more the pity that she will not join your household." Mrs. Shippen laid down her fork. "You're not buying her, Catherine." "Sadly, no," Mrs. Green sighed dramatically. "Nathaniel says it would be imprudent with the war still on." "Well, then," Mrs. Shippen said, "I have a friend in Virginia who could use a seamstress." Bellingham nodded. "Your concern is touching, madam," he said, as I removed his plate of bones and gristle. "But I've already concluded the matter. Colonel Gilpin of Maryland has purchased Isabel as a wedding gift for his new bride." Mrs. Green pouted. "Please tell me she won't be leaving until I do." Isabel placed a dish of gooseberry tart in front of Bellingham. "I'm afraid she must," Bellingham said. "The colonel has arranged to send a wagon of his belongings home this week. Isabel shall be going with it." There was a knocking on the front door, but I was too stunned by Bellingham's words to respond. Isabel did a better job at concealing her thoughts than I did. She collected the dirty plates from the other gentlemen. After she stacked them on the tray by the door in the kitchen, with her back to the table, she quickly wiped her eyes on the loose neckcloth. She sniffed once and took a sharp breath before turning around, her features again in a mask of indifference. There was a second knock at the door. "Attend that," Bellingham ordered. "Bonsoir," the Marquis de Lafayette said as I opened the door. Though only 20 years of age, the Marquis was said to be one of the richest men in France. He'd volunteered to help the American cause and had become the favorite of General Washington's, as well as Mrs. Green's, for he was handsome, charming, and a wee bit devilish, which made good gossip, as all the ladies in camp were fond of him. "Good evening, sir," I said. "It is indeed." He handed me his hat and gloves and hurried past me into the dining room, where he was greeted with cheers from the assembled company. I set his hat on the shelf by the door and laid his gloves flat next to it, then followed him, taking up the wine bottle from the side table as I passed it. Isabel had disappeared into the kitchen with a tray of dishes to be washed. I poured the Marquis a glass of wine, which he lifted up. "Mon Dieu, you must hear my news," he said. "His Excellency has appointed me to lead a battalion and hunt the British." Bellingham lifted his glass. "Huzzah! May you thrash them soundly." The entire company toasted the sentiment, and I was kept busy refilling their glasses. "Which companies are you leading?" asked the fellow who so loved the biscuits. "All of Poor's brigade, McLean's men, and the Oneidas, some 2,000 fellows in all." He could not help but grin. "I can tell you I'm most honored by His Excellency's faith in me." Mrs. Green said something quickly in French that made the Marquis blush. "No, madame," he answered, "it is not the same as leading the entire army. This is the privilege General Washington alone. My forces tomorrow will provide only the prelude of what is to come." "Tomorrow?" Mrs. Green fluttered her fan. "Oui," he sipped his wine. "That is why I've come so late to your lovely dinner, and why I must leave so soon." I took my place by the door, hoping that no one could see that I was shaking. Tomorrow is our last chance to run. Our only chance. Chapter 59. Sunday, May 17th to Monday, May 18th, 1778. The Marquis de Lafayette left early along with the officers' wives, but more fellows arrived to continue the party along after Mrs. Green had retired. Hannah's husband, Isaac, came from headquarters with the wagon to take her home. She was a kind soul and had prepared much more food than required for her dinner party when she realized how Isabel had been struggling in the kitchen. I moved back and forth between kitchen and dining room, helping Isabel with the washing up and tending to the needs of the gentlemen deep in conversation and tending about the best way to unseat the British from Philadelphia. Just when I was on the brink of screaming at them, a contagion of yawning passed from one fellow to the next. The visitors asked me to bring their horses around to the front door. Once they've departed and the gentlemen of Moore Hall had gone up the stairs, I finally had the chance to speak with Isabel and plan our escape. But I did not even get the first word out of my mouth before Bellingham walked in. I jumped to my feet. Sir, is something the matter? Do you require me? He yawned. Not me and not you. Mrs. Green is restless in her sleep and says she feels ill. I think she just misses her husband. She'd like Isabel to sit with her. Now? Isabel asked. For the night, Bellingham added. You may move your pallet to her chamber. Make her up a pot of tea with whatever herbs one uses for calming. Yes, sir. Isabel swung the kettle over the fire. Thank you, sir, I said, though there was nothing to thank him for. He gave me an absent nod but did not leave, preferring to watch Isabel take down a clean teapot from the shelf and walk to the larder for the tea. Fetch her pallet, will you? I did not want to leave her alone in a room with him, but I had little choice. I ran up 2 flights of stairs, not worrying about the sound of my heavy footsteps disturbing the sleep of anyone. If he had ill intent in mind, I might prevent it by causing a ruckus. I grabbed her pallet and blankets and thudded back down the stairs. Isabel must have been working as fast as me, for I came down the attic steps she and Bellingham were coming down the hall. I took it upon myself to knock loudly on Mrs. Green's door. Isabel's here, ma'am. I followed Isabel into her chamber, laid out the pallet as slow as I could, then bowed and departed. Bellingham had gone into his chamber by then, to my relief. I waited a bit in the dark kitchen, hoping that Isabel would be able to sneak out and we could escape in the night. We could make our way close to camp and hide in the woods near the bridge, then work our way into the crowd that was sure to gather to see Lafayette's troops. When she did not creep down the stairs, I realized I had to prepare for the both of us. My first task was to examine the kiwied cast. I took a candle out to my sleeping shed and uncovered the pail from its hiding place behind the woodpile. After removing the brick at the top layer of the sand, I held the lead piece in the light. For that was all it was, a thin puddle of lead with sand stuck to it. In no way did it resemble a key.